Well, hello there. Kumusta po kayo? How are you? And thanks for tuning in to another edition of Paul de Guzman Presents Art. So we're just right in front of the Outsiders and Others Gallery here in Strathcona in Vancouver, which is built on the ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we're just about to go inside the gallery. We're going to go and have a look at the work of Kevin House, who is a local artist, a local musician, as well as a storyteller. And we're going to go and have a look at the work that he's done for this show, which comprises of paintings, sculptures in the form of models and maquettes, as well as some wall works and some freestanding sculptures. So I hope you enjoy it. I think it's going to be a fantastic show. And let's go in, okay? Okay, so I thought we'd just be outside having a look at the signage for Outsiders and Others, and I had to pause for a few minutes or for a few seconds because a few police cars went by. That's kind of like the nature of this neighborhood. So we're just gonna go inside and have a look at the work of Kevin House. And we're just gonna go have a look at the poster that they have for this show, which is called the Roadside Museum of the Mind, on until about July 27th. So as is customary in my videos, I usually do a little pan of the show. And while we're doing a pan for the show, I'm gonna go and read a little bit of the press release. By the way, everything that I say in terms of like the press release and the gallery hours and the gallery information is going to be contained in the description area. So please refer to that a little bit later. So the press release, and some of these are quoted from Kevin himself. Here we go. I like to think of my practice as private investigative work in a sense, working intuitively through a multitude of mediums to uncover some kind of mysterious narrative. A book about a book that never got written, an artist who destroyed all of his paintings, photographs and sculptures of cameras that are not exactly cameras, the last ticket booth, letters to and from a star, conundrumology. I love that word, conundrumology. And I think that's going to sort of be one of the topics for this video. The Phantom Crutch Company are some of the works on display. This latest work is a collection of sculptures, paintings, and photographs that I imagine discovering buried in some attic, flea market, or museum in the mind. The subconscious will do most of the work. So we're just going to go flip over to the other side because there's a few more works on the other side over here, slowly. And I just have to pay attention and put hours in to the subconscious. So I've known Kevin House for a while. I run into him occasionally walking up and down certain boulevards and certain streets in Vancouver. Of course, I've lost touch with him during the pandemic, and I think everybody has that sort of like sense about the pandemic in terms of losing track with a lot of people. And it's such a wonderful surprise to sort of like see him one day on Main Street here in Vancouver, and I asked him, "What are you doing these days?" And at that time, he told me about this show, which was like about a year and a half ago. And he was also telling me about a project that he's been doing dealing with a character that he's developed called Isolation Boy, which is basically a person dealing with isolation during the pandemic, or maybe not even during the pandemic. Because, like we all kind of like deal with isolation in our own personal way, regardless of whether there's a pandemic or not. And the thing about the work is that it is kind of like difficult to categorize, and I'm not even going to go into that academic discourse of categorizing it. But the thing about the work that I find particularly interesting, especially with the models, is the scale that Kevin House uses. I mean, it's not like a particular sort of like scale where it's an HO scale or something, or 1/32 or whatever. The scales are varying. And when I spoke with him briefly during the opening, he did mention something about the magic of scale in terms of like when something is reduced, for example, in scale, or when something is actually aggrandized or made really really big in scale. Um, it kind of conjures up different meanings for us. Like for example, these crutches, like this is my hand in comparison to the crutches. So the crutches are only about, I would say, 12 inches tall. And these are all handmade crutches. And a lot of the work here are actually handcrafted by the artist. Um, like, for example, these pieces are all handcrafted. They are made mostly of cardboard, glass, and paint. And a certain sense of patination that he puts into his works were more a result of his experience with antiques and the antique business. And a lot of them have these sort of like narratives incorporated in each of the works because he tends to sort of like create stories. Most of them, of course, are fictive, and but he's a bit of a trickster actually because he kind of like makes you think that maybe the narratives that are being written are actually factual, and it's kind of timely these days because when you're kind of like looking at fake news and what to believe and what not to believe, this tends to sort of like exemplify that as well in terms of narratives. Is it fiction or is it nonfiction? And sometimes, you get to the point where you're actually being sold the narrative because it's more like this sense about being sold the Brooklyn Bridge or something like that. And he did actually spend some time in New York back in the, let's see now, the 90s, the mid 90s to 2000s. And I think from the various articles that I've read about him, that's where he kind of like got his footing in terms of the outsider art movement. He met some people there or a person there, and then he started to create these large banners that are sort of like reminiscent of circus banners. And he painted like dog portraits, and the dog portraits took off. And there's a lot of people who are interested in the dog portraits, and it was a really good moneymaker for him, I think. And so the scale at that time was really quite large. The banners they're like circus banners, Barnum and Bailey circus type of banners. And then you fast forward a couple of decades, and now he's into the miniatures now. And I've been meaning to ask him about that, so I might actually have an opportunity during the artist talk, which is going to happen next week. So perhaps that'll be a topic of really good conversation. When I first saw the work, especially these works that I'm showing you right now, specifically this one, it's kind of reminiscent of Art Deco, and I'm a person who really loves watching Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot. So when I saw these pieces, I was thinking, wow, this would be such an appropriate sort of like decor for those sets because they have this sort of like sense of nostalgia about them. And each of these pieces, there are certain sort of like antiquing or patination that happens. And he is actually well versed in that because he did sort of like dabble in the antique business at some point. And he also likes to sort of like go to flea markets and sort of like create and look at objects and sort of be influenced by the objects. There was a very interesting conversation I had with a colleague of mine in the academic circles about the independent life of objects, about how objects tend to sort of like dictate to us their histories. And at some point, if you're sensitive to those histories, perhaps those objects will imbue their knowledge over to you. And I think that might be a really nice narrative, whether it's fictive or not, to sort of like ascribe to these objects. Like when you look at this, it's almost like this particular one is looks like a leather bag for a small doctor, a very, very small doctor, or maybe for a mouse or something like that, or a squirrel. And funny enough, a lot of the miniature objects here, like for example, the crutches that I showed earlier, or even this piece, or even these camera pieces, you kind of like wonder who can, if they were actually functional, because I was told that these cameras aren't functional. But if they were functional, who would be able to use them? And I remember about 10 years ago, I encountered this work by this artist. His name is Bill Burns. And he created this project called Safety Gear for Animals. So he would create these little safety gloves for squirrels, or like safety boots for like raccoons and stuff like that. And they're really quite funny and whimsical. And he even had like blueprints and all that stuff for all of these these animals that he's imagining, that he's actually creating safety gear from. So in a sense, it's kind of like that type of sort of like sense of fictive imagination that I really quite enjoy about these works. I also wanted to sort of like just go back to these sort of like round objects, because I know that I encountered one of his pieces one time. It was a painted tambourine, and it was a very beautiful painted tambourine. It was an actual tambourine, and it kind of like has the same size. But when I look at these, the size of these discs seem to sort of like be reminiscent of a 45 RPM record. Now, for those of you who are not old enough to know what a 45 RPM, I'm going to put some information down in the bottom of the screen. But incidentally, it's basically a type of record that's played in jukeboxes. And funny enough, you know, the jukeboxes is a sort of like a 50s, 60s, 70s sort of like a phenomenon here in North America. I don't know if if they're popular in Europe. But the phenomenon of that 50s and 60s tend to sort of lend a certain patination when you look at these types of works. It's almost like these works were aged but not really antiqued to the point of being sort of like a centenarian or 100-year-old object. They are sort of like from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and even the photographs themselves have this sort of like film noir quality from like before the 1950s. If you ever encounter Kevin on the street, you should actually sort of concentrate more on what he's wearing, because he always wears a hat, and he always wears like a jacket that's kind of like tweed or something like that. It's very almost English style, I would think. And it's almost coming from like the 1940s, 1950s. But during the summertime, of course, he would actually wear more sort of like linen garb, and because of the temperature. But there is this certain sort of sartorial presence that you see from him. And a lot of the work that he does here, they are they are narrative based, they're fiction based, but they're also sort of like coming from a sense of musicality, because he is a musician and he loves to sort of like write lyrics, and from these lyrics come these sort of like stories that he develops into short stories and narratives. I read an article recently that says that the most creative time for him is the first half an hour to an hour after he wakes up. You know, he would actually go, and during the time that he's preparing his coffee or something, he would actually go and come up with something, and we start writing. And that's the most creative period for him. And there's a lot of work that went into this body of work, because I think he dedicated about a couple of years to sort of like finish everything. And so I'm not sure whether he is coming up with another series of works, perhaps what his imagination is coming up with, but these are actually quite compelling pieces that kind of like bring you forward as well as bring you back. I'm just going to focus on this Phantom Crutch Company. And the one thing that you have to sort of take into consideration with regard to these pieces is this sense of absurdity, which actually sort of like functions as comedy, functions as joy, some functions as sort of like hilarious take on our society. And I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to end it on that note. I'm just going to do a little bit of a pan of the show. And I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, you can click the like button. You can also share this on your social media channels. And you can also subscribe to the channel. It's all free for you to enjoy. Thank you so much for spending time with me. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. You have a great day. And as always, I hope art informs your life. Goodbye.